Well, essentially, it pushes back on the notion that China can get whatever it wants without anybody pushing back. In Southeast Asia at the moment, there's a number of countries that would really dearly love to have some other support in the neighbourhood in the face of relentless pursuit of Chinese aspirations in the South China Sea and beyond. The contravention of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the assertion of its so-called 9-dash line, despite the Arbitral Tribunal ruling of 2016, and the massed application of maritime militias, that they've been playing a game of intimidation for quite some time. Australia's been bearing the brunt of this through the exercise of China's sharp power as well. But essentially, for Australia, we have had submarines for generations. What we've realised, though, is that the diesel electric propulsion submarines we've had of old no longer cut it. Essentially, they're detectable. And if you are detectable, you lose your stealth. And if you lose your stealth, you might as well pack up and go home. So the idea of a nuclear propulsion submarine makes eminent sense. And China understands that very, very well, which is exactly why they don't want Australia to get them. They know that if they huff and puff, they will probably intimidate other people out of doing it. And they might even persuade some of the Australian electorate that this is a bad idea. We have a former Prime Minister who's calling it out, saying we shouldn't do it. But on a bipartisan basis in Australia, there is rock solid resolve that we will proceed down this path because we need nuclear propulsion submarines. And that's become patently clear in recent years. And that's confirmed by the views from the UK and the United States, who are pretty much in lockstep in agreement on this as well.
The trouble is that this deal could take years before it'll actually result in those new submarines being deployed in the Pacific. And quite a lot could have changed in the region by then.
Yeah, but there are 4 steps along the way that will see an interim transition where over the next 4 years, we'll see UK and US nuclear propulsion submarines coming to visit Australia. From 2027 onwards, we're going to see a rotational force of submarines based in Western Australia. And thereafter, only a few years later, the first acquisition of a Virginia-class nuclear propulsion submarine, of which we're planning to get 3, followed that by the construction of one that's going to be done with the UK, the AUKUS SSN, which is a follow-on from the Astute design. So this is actually a pretty well thought out plan, and it's one China's clearly annoyed about because it doesn't want it to work. That is clearly inimical to their interests, which is to basically persuade everybody to back off and give them what they want without a fight.
John, one very last brief point, if I may, Professor Blackstone. We had President Panuelo of Micronesia effectively publicly accusing China of blackmail and of putting huge pressure on him and other leaders in the region to cooperate with its defence ambitions to establish bases across that part of Asia. Do you think there is a changing political mood in even some of the smaller countries?
Yeah, that's evident. What we're seeing is relentless, unrestricted competition, legally, psychologically, media attacks, and there's pushback in Fiji, in Vanuatu, in many places across the Pacific, and even in Southeast Asia. Quietly, people will say, "Look, we're not going to go public in criticising China, but we're kind of happy that Australia's standing up on this." And Australia's been working very, very hard to persuade the neighbours that this is actually an act of goodwill and an act of stabilisation and an act of giving them some breathing space so that they're not completely beholden to China, breathing down their necks and insisting on asserting their claims at the expense of those of the neighbouring contiguous states. This is a big game. It's not over yet. It's got a long way to go, and this is clearly something. The reaction speaks volumes about, in my estimation, about how important it is that this plan is followed through.
Professor
and
John
it's got bipartisan support in 3 countries.
Professor John Black.